Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Ho, ho, ho! Welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville government, politics, news, business, education, arts, dining, I don't know, whatever catches our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com, joined as always by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
Oh, I could be better. I try to carry on the since he obviously failed. Carry on the Grinch's tradition. I'm trying to stop.
The Grinch gave up, man.
I know, and I know what
he got assimilated by Big Christmas.
I know. So
he's out there selling credit cards now too.
Yeah, and I'm trying to stop Christmas from coming. So there.
Well, we are.
But my heart could be growing 3 sizes too large now.
Yeah, I'll believe that when I see
it.
Yeah, well. We are taping this on Friday, but we're going to be releasing it on Christmas Eve, December 24th. So if you happen to be listening to this on Christmas Eve, I hope that your holiday is going well.
And I do too. My previous comments notwithstanding.
Scott wishes you a more or less Merry Christmas. We are making merry in the studio here today, actually. We are, I guess this is a tradition now. If you do something 2 years in a row, that's a tradition, right?
I think so.
So we have a bottle of Pennsylvania Dutch eggnog available at all your finest wine and liquor stores this time of year. Good stuff. And hopefully that will lighten our own moods here as we do talk about some news that actually happened this week, even though it is the week before Christmas, often a time when not much is going on. Not so much the case. This week, Scott, to me, felt a little bit more like that end of semester rush where everybody has to hurry up to get stuff done by their deadlines. There were all these state reports that came out, local reports, things we're going to be talking about. It's kind of like everybody's like, oh yeah, let's finish this up and get it done before New Year's.
Oh yeah, they wanted to get it off their desk so they can start next year with a clean slate. So there was a lot of dumping, as it's usually called.
That's right.
A lot of document dumping at the end of the it's not the end of the year yet, but then nobody's going to be doing any work next week.
It's the end of the government.
Yeah. Government. The one thing government does early is it ends its calendar year.
Yeah, everybody goes home or goes on vacation. So what we have to talk about this week is the State Department of Education finally, after 7 years, released school-by-school letter grades for nearly every public school in the state. We're going to look at what that means and some of the controversies around it. The Knoxville Police Department released a study that had also been in the works for quite a while, looking at recommendations for its operations and culture. Growing opposition to a growth plan amendment that has been promulgated by County Mayor Glenn Jacobs seems to be running into a fair amount of concern. We will talk about that. And to start us off, Scott, last Saturday, Mayor India Kincannon was formally inaugurated for her second term, and you sat down to talk to her about what she is looking forward to and hoping to promote and accomplish over the next 4 years. So let's talk a little bit about that. What's on the mayor's agenda?
Yeah, the ceremony was suitably enough pomp and circumstance. One thing that you need to bring up, did have the first new municipal judge.
That's right.
Since 1986, sworn in, Tyler Cavanis, and Mayor Kincannon gave her speech. I'd sat down and talked with her before that, a little bit about some of her plans, and a lot of it is going to be kind of ratcheting up what she's already done. I mean, one of the things that she mentioned was that her reelection, and she was easily won reelection in a 4-person primary in August, is that it was a confirmation that the voters of Knoxville liked the direction that she was taking the city and wanted that to continue. So, she outlined 4 priorities, and both in the speech that she gave and in talking with me. And one of them was, or they were, public safety, housing, creating great spaces, and then that kind of nebulous, making Knoxville a great place to live. So, with public safety, a lot of it is more of the same. She's been touting the reduction in homicides, because homicides are off by about 35% compared to last year. Continuing to kind of, I don't know if reform is might be too big of a word, but readjusting how KPD operates. The study we'll be talking about later is part of that. Continuing the violence interruption programs. She takes a pretty expansive view of safety. So Vision Zero, which is their goal of eliminating vehicular related deaths on city streets by 2040. So a lot of what she's going to be doing will be focused on in those. In fact, one thing that's already happened is we've had, and I think we talked about this last week, an $8 million federal grant for the Vision Zero program that'll go into Magnolia Avenue, which I'll also talk about in a second. Then housing is a big issue. It's been probably one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue, that's been on the city's plate. One of the things that they've had difficulties with is they've proposed things here and there, but there hasn't been a thing where you can point to a this is what we're going to do overall with housing. They are developing that. That is, in January, they're planning to roll out a comprehensive strategy for housing. Some of it will be things we've already talked about, like the middle housing proposal, like the extending incentives to older existing apartment buildings and developments, so that landlords will have a reason to keep rents low. Things like that. But she's also talking about expanding the homemakers program to which takes blighted houses and puts them back to gets developers to refurbish them and get them back in the tax rolls, or at least to beneficial use. They were already on the tax rolls, but get it back to beneficial use. That's going to be expanded to allow things like duplexes and triplexes on that, which they can't do right now under the homemakers program. And then the big thing is that she's really pushing. This could be a major change, and this is for affordable housing. Is that she is pushing for getting philanthropists involved. People can already donate to the housing, the affordable housing fund. They set it up that way, but they're going to make a push for it and make a formal outreach to the business and philanthropy community with a goal of getting donations up to $3 million a year over the next 4 years to go toward affordable housing. Now that, of course, $3 to $4 million or $3 million a year doesn't build anything, what it does with the other funding that the city provides for affordable housing, helps in smaller amounts, helps developers bridge the gap in funding, because it's notoriously difficult to fund affordable housing projects, and it helps them make building those projects more affordable, which makes rents. It enables them to keep rents affordable. So that's going to be a major change in how they fund the affordable housing fund, and then.
And this is in addition to public funding, right?
Yes.
Because the city is committed to putting $5 million a year at least into affordable housing from now through, I forget the. Yeah,
they've got this is the third year. This third year of a 10-year thing. And they actually every year have appropriated more than the $5. The $5 million is a floor, not a ceiling. So they've. I think this year it's around $7 million, and it's been as much as $8 million in the past. So they've had this is the third. We're in the middle of the third year they've been doing it, and that's also in addition to the federal funding that the city gets from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development,
which is what they're using, for example, for their Transforming Western. Project that KCDC is doing with Western Heights.
Yeah, there's a lot of HUD money there. There's a lot of other money too. In fact, there's a lot of philanthropist money that's supposed to be going into that as well. It's a huge project. That's one of the projects that Kincannon is pointing to, that they are tangible evidence that they're really investing in affordable housing, because Western Heights is a public housing development, and Transforming Western is a $400 million revisioning of what Western Heights can be, and then they're also, and this kind of goes to the great spaces thing. She wants to create great public spaces. The Magnolia Avenue thing we talked about last week. We talked about all the projects that are going in Magnolia Avenue. They're wanting to create a redevelopment area along the Magnolia corridor from basically from the stadium area, Hall of Fame Drive area, to Burlington and the zoo. About a 3-mile stretch. It's a long stretch of roadway. They want to establish a redevelopment area there so that property owners get tax incentives to refurbish their buildings. Most of them are commercial buildings, but that really wouldn't matter. It could be residential as well, but really get some try to encourage investment in the Magnolia corridor, which as we've noted and the city has talked about, and people in East Knoxville have talked about, has not seen a considerable amount of new investment in decades, and so that is a major push. And then there's also the redevelopment of the half of the St. Mary's site, the original hospital building, and other in areas adjacent to that. They're wanting to get they've been talking with the potential bidders for development of that area to see what exactly is feasible. That's going to be something that's going to come forward. Of course, we've got the McClung warehouses. They're looking at issuing a request for proposal for that. So that would be out there. And plus the stadium is under construction, and the first pitch will be in 2025 if things go according to plan. And
coming along quick. Anybody who's not been down there recently, you can really see the physical structure of the stadium taking shape right now.
Yeah, the bones of the stadium are pretty much in place. You can look and see, that's going to be a stadium. It's not just, that's a bunch of bulldozers moving around dirt. This is it is really taking shape. The opening of that, of course, that includes 24/7 public spaces as well. And there's one plaza that's going to go next to the stadium that's basically the size of Market Square. and then some other, and there will be street facing parts of the stadium that will have businesses that will be open to the public at all times. So they're really pushing that, and all of that kind of goes together. Of course, I mentioned earlier, this is kind of nebulous, that kind of quality of life thing that she did concede that she's pretty much a technocrat. When I talked to her, she goes, "Oh yeah, I'm kind of wonkish and policy oriented, but the whole point of all these things is to make Knoxville a healthier and happier place for people.
Healthier, happier, more affordable, more prosperous.
Yes,
all of the good things.
All of the good things, the quality of life things that they always talk about. So, she's very cognizant of the time constraints. That was one of the themes of her inaugural speech was, she has, 1,460 days to, and of course now there's fewer than that, by about 7, to do these things. And she basically said that she needs to make every day count and that sort of thing. So, but it's some of these things are fairly ambitious. Some of them are as mentioned at the beginning, kind of, a continuation of what she has already done.
Well, and I do think those time constraints, people sometimes underestimate how hard it is to do any of this stuff, how long it takes. And I can say, having worked for the city during most of 2 terms of a mayor's time in office, stuff that we started talking about like in the first year, there's some of that stuff that didn't even really get going until like the 6th year. Like it's just, all of these things have long lead times. The public processes are long, and anytime you're spending a lot of money, then you only have so much capacity at any given time. And so, that time, 8 years in office can sound like a long time, but it can fly by. Yeah,
in fact, a couple of these things we're talking about began in the Rogero administration. Right. The St. Mary's, the whole finding a new home for the public safety complex and then landing on St. Mary's, that began then. One of the things when the mayor talked about Magnolia Avenue, she referenced the South Waterfront. That began under Bill Haslam, and is only just in the last couple of years really taken off. And of course, we had a recession and a pandemic, both in between the time it began and the time and now. But it does take a long time, and mayors do inherit projects from their predecessors, and they still have to finish them up. I mean, the stadium talks began under Mayor Rogero, but the building of the stadium has started under Mayor Concannon. So, and while it will be complete by while she is still in office, halfway through her second term, a lot of the development that they hope will come as a result of the stadium is probably going to come when her successor is in.
Right. Yep. Well, we'll certainly be following all of those things as they develop. Another thing we are following as it develops is this proposal by County Mayor Glenn Jacobs to amend the county's growth policy plan. And this is one of these things that is a little bit hard to talk about. Scott, I feel like we talk about this a lot with land use issues in particular. They sound really boring when you the county has a growth policy plan, and for the last 2 months we have had meetings of something called the Growth Policy Coordinating Committee to consider an amendment to the plan. And just saying that makes me sleepy, Growth Policy Coordinating Committee.
Yeah, it's boring until they come in and the farm that's next to your house is turned into a subdivision. Then it's not so boring.
Well, and that is what has interestingly started to happen here. So we've talked about this before, but basically this proposal to amend the growth plan is a product of the Advanced Knox planning update that's been going on for almost 2 years now. And we've talked about this. The county hired a consultant. They had a bunch of public meetings and input sessions and studies looking at, assuming that Knox County is going to continue to grow, and the projections all show that it is going to continue to grow, although there's some debate about how quickly. How are we going to, as a community, absorb that growth in a way that works out to the benefit of the people who already live here and doesn't just make everybody's life harder with more congested roads, more crowded schools, just kind of all of the infrastructure that needs to be there. And also, how do you preserve some of those less tangible quality of life things that people value about where they live, depending on where they live? But in particular, what's going on with this discussion about the growth policy plan is how much development and what level of intensity and density of development should be allowed in what have been rural parts of the county, are especially in East Knox County, which remains the most rural part of the county, kind of looping around down to sort of southeast Knox County. You can kind of think of it as a range from like high school in the north all the way down around to, Governor John Sevier Highway in the south. And this proposal by Jacobs, which is built on what came out of the Advanced Knox process, although there is some contention about how well this proposal really reflects the priorities that came out of the Advanced Knox process. But one of the things it does is it designates about 17 and a half square miles of currently rural land for what they call planned growth. And so the growth policy plan is a state-mandated plan, and it's complicated, but also at a basic level, it's a map. And you can find the current map online. You can also find the proposed changes to the current map at the Advanced Knox website. But that map just kind of lays out, there's really only 3 categories on the map that are defined by state law. There's the urban growth area, which for our purposes is basically the city of Knoxville and then kind of the heavily developed suburban areas right around it. Then there's the rural area, which on the map helpfully shows up as green, which is the undeveloped areas, most of it currently zoned agricultural in exactly those rural areas that I was just talking about. And then in between those, there's the planned growth area. And the planned growth area is where the fights always happen, because that's where essentially the urbanizing forces of development are moving out into the rural areas. And the whole question is, where do you draw those lines? And where do you say, okay, this portion of currently rural land makes sense to designate for future growth and development because, it's adjacent to a major commercial corridor, or because there's a new school that was just built there that can accommodate it. Those kinds of things. But pretty predictably, because this is how these things usually go. We saw this with the Recode Knoxville process a few years ago when the city went through its zoning update. The first year or so, when you're having all the public input sessions, go pretty smoothly, because it's kind of everybody shows up, they say, we like this, we don't like that, we want this, we want that. And the Advanced Knox process, like the Recode process, highlighted some existing divides in how people conceive of the county. And those divides are not necessarily like between one group of people and another group of people. A lot of times it's the same people saying, in the case of Advanced Knox, saying, you know what, we really do need to accommodate growth, and we need to allow at least some areas in the unincorporated parts of the county where we're going to have sort of urban, sort of town center type developments where you could have mixed use, commercial developments, denser housing, including multifamily housing, apartment complexes, and those kinds of things. Like, yeah, we do need those. And most people in the public input sessions said, yes, we do want to see and we do want to accommodate more growth. But at the same time, those same people said, you know what, we also want to preserve our rural areas, and we love, how beautiful East Tennessee is, which it certainly is, depending on where in East Tennessee you are. Yeah. And the places that are beautiful, we want to keep them as being beautiful. That's why we like living here. And so those are like shared value. Like, a lot of people want both of those things. The problem comes in defining exactly where the one is going to be allowed and the other is going to be preserved. And so as we've gone through this Growth Policy Coordinating Committee process, they've had 3 meetings now, and every one of those the first meeting, I think there were only like 5 members of the public who showed up to speak. It was very sparsely attended. But then as concerns started to grow about the possible development and loss of prime agricultural land, farmland, especially in East Knox County, and then also just kind of the potential loss of those open, beautiful green spaces that everybody loves, more people have gotten engaged. Community organizations have started getting engaged. Local farmers have gotten more organized than I've seen East Tennessee farmers in a long time, maybe ever.
Ever in my case. I've been here for my entire life.
I've never seen a coalition of farmers come forward like the one we're seeing now. And so at the second meeting, there were more people. And then at the third meeting, which happened just this past Tuesday, and this is a week before Christmas, mind you, hard time typically to get people to come out to a meeting. I didn't do an exact head count, but there were dozens and dozens, 50, 60, 70, I don't know. There were a lot of people there. And a bad sign for anybody trying to push through a change is when people start showing up to the meetings angry and they have signs. And they don't just have handmade signs. They have professionally made signs with a logo and a website. And that's what the opposition to this has now coalesced into. There is a website, knoxgrowth.org, that you can go to that lists all of their concerns about these changes to the growth plan and lists all of the people and groups and organizations, farmers, conservation groups, the Tennessee Cattlemen's Association, and then the Knox County Planning Alliance and a whole bunch of community and homeowners associations from especially those more rural parts of the county, all coming together and saying, not saying just don't do anything. And this is usually what people who have concerns about some new growth or development do, is they say, we're not anti-growth, right?
Yeah.
Like, we hear this all the time.
Yeah. We're not anti-growth, but that is if I had a nickel for every time I've heard that phrase, I would be a rich man.
Right. We're pro smart growth. We're pro growth that is accommodated by existing infrastructure, or that infrastructure is built to accommodate before the growth comes and overwhelms us and so forth. And so I think this is turning into an interesting conversation and an interesting challenge for Mayor Jacobs, because in order to get these changes through, he's got to jump through a bunch of hoops. First, there's this Growth Policy Coordinating Committee, which gets a first vote on it, but that vote is just a recommendation. That's just the committee members saying, yeah, we favor this, and they can and probably will make some adjustments to this amendment. Like, if they do recommend its passage, it will probably be with some changes to what's there right now. But regardless of whether they recommend it or not, to actually change this plan under state law requires the approval of Knox County Commission, Knoxville City Council, and the Town of Farragut Board of Mayor and Aldermen. 3 different bodies. And Scott, I think we both know that if this goes to those bodies in a form that is going to bring 100 people with signs out saying, save our farms, save our way of life, save the beautiful East Tennessee landscape, that's going to be a hard sell for county commissioners, for city council members, and for those Farragut representatives. And, the city and Farragut, in a lot of ways, aren't directly affected by this because they're already pretty developed, and this plan only affects the unincorporated parts of the county. But under state law, they still get a say in it. And so it is by no means a gimme that either city council or Farragut is just going to say, yeah, whatever, it's the county's deal, you go ahead and do what you want. The last time that Jacobs tried to amend this plan in 2020, Farragut voted it down. The city council and county commission approved it, but it was Farragut that actually stopped it. And so I think what Jacobs is trying to do is figure out how he can make enough adjustments to the plan to navigate all of that and get it passed, but still also accomplish what he wants. And he's been very clear that the primary need he sees is for more housing and for the county to make it easier to build more kinds of housing, more places. And so that's what he's trying to accomplish. But people who have not been super engaged or paying attention to the Advanced Knox process up to this point are starting to get engaged. And, there's going to be at least one more meeting of this Growth Policy Committee before they make some kind of vote. And then you're going to have to go through these other bodies. And so it's looking like the mayor's going to have to, he's got some tough hoeing to do in the first months of 2024.
Yeah, these big planning, this Recode Knoxville, other processes that are a little bit smaller than these, but where there is a lot of public input and all. There's an interesting dynamic because they encourage this public input, and those who do participate, and there's generally decent participation. They're excited about it. They're getting to say what they want to have done, and people are listening to them, and it's the feel good part of it then. But when the decision makers, in this case it's Mayor Jacobs, comes out with, okay, well, this is the proposal I'm going to take from this, all of a sudden somebody who's been advocating for one thing that's not included in the plan, they weren't listened to.
Yep.
Well, then they get really angry because they said, well, we talked about this and you're ignoring me. Well, yeah, and that happens regardless of who's doing this or whatever, because these input sessions, that doesn't mean they're not being heard. This just means that they're not following what you necessarily want, and it's and then you get people going to meetings, you get people, and whether they generally it's really not that they weren't listened to, it was that they were listened to and rejected. That's the thing, and there's all, this is kind of a dynamic that plays out all the time, and this is playing out now. Of course, we can sit back and say, oh, this is a dynamic that we, it's not our farm. It's not,
right.
we don't live in the subdivision that's on a narrow, curvy road where they worried about adding 3 more subdivisions, and the schools are we're not, so it's easy for us to sit back and look at the dynamic, but it is a serious thing because this is going to be, this is the blueprint for growth in the county. The county population is exploding, and so this is going to affect the lives of Knox Countyans, even those of us who live in the city of Knoxville and don't have that dog in the fight directly. It's going to affect all of us for the next decade at least.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who lives in the city but periodically has to drive out to West Knox County knows that we are affected by growth as well. Anytime you're sitting on the interstate wondering how long it's going to take you to get to, Campbell Station Road or whatever, all of this is partly driven by that. So, right, it does affect all of us. And the other interesting factor at play here is that we have county elections coming up, including the primary in March, and there's 7 county commission seats on the ballots. And I've seen there were several candidates at this growth committee meeting last week. They are paying attention to it, and so I think we can expect to see this as a hot topic of conversation there too, which could certainly affect how county commission views it when they finally get a proposal, if they do. So all of that is more to talk about in 2024, but if you want to get caught up on it, we do have coverage of it, of course, on our website. You can also go to the Advanced Knox website, click on the Growth Policy tab, and they have all the documents and maps there, and also that knoxgrowth.org site lists a lot of the concerns and ways to get engaged if you want to get engaged. Okay, another long-term process, Scott, that has been underway for a while here. The Knoxville Police Department, since Chief Paul Noel came in, has been looking at kind of a top-to-bottom review of its operations and culture and so forth. And there was a big study of this that just came out this week.
Yeah, Noel was, he's hired from the New Orleans Police Department. He's kind of got this reputation as being a reformer. So one of the things he's doing is looking at all the policies and procedures and seeing what should be changed, needs to be changed. And this is part of that. They did it. They've hired a group called 21CP Solutions that came from the 21st Century Policing Initiative that began under President Obama. A lot of the people who are these consultants were involved in that, and it's about modernizing law enforcement agencies across the country. They did a culture study of KPD that came out last year or earlier this year, and then it looks at the policies and procedures. This looks at how officers do what they do and how they can do them better. And this is extensive. The report was lengthy. It had 41 recommendations across a variety of topics. There were some key takeaways. One is that basically they viewed KPD's policies and on some of them really important topics to be kind of vague, where they needed to be more specific, give officers more guidance so that they don't make mistakes, essentially, so that they know what to do in what situations. So they need to be more specific, and also kind of expanding, where KPD gets some of its training. Look outside the department, look out to learn from people in the community with expertise. And the other thing is training. It recommends ratcheting up training. I mean, just training on all kinds of topics. I'll get to that in a minute, but basically, KPD, they think KPD officers need more training and consistent training over time, not just take a class and you know everything you know about that topic. It's ongoing training. So this is one thing that the consultants mentioned was kind of unusual, and I thought was interesting, was that police departments don't do this voluntarily. This organization, 21CP Solutions, does do these top to bottom reviews. Generally, it's after something horrible's court order, or
right. The Department of Justice is breathing down their neck.
Yeah. And so some kind of but this was just done in general. Hey, come in and tell us what we need to do better. Lots of stuff in there. Lots of ways it could be changed. They looked at use of force, which of course is a big deal with police departments, especially we go back to George Floyd, and all kinds of. They want more detailed guidelines for that. When you can use force, when do you not use force? What kind of force you use? That sort of thing. And then they really get in the weeds on a lot of this, and I'll get in a couple of weeds, but I'll try not to get too far. Well, one of them is that KPD has traditionally had this continuum of force, and it's a chart, basically, that looks at situations in escalating levels of threat. But these escalating levels of threat, and then what your response ought to be as an officer, and it only goes in one direction. And their point is that situations are more fluid than that. Sometimes, the threat might go up, but then it might come back down. And officers need to be aware of that and to adjust during the middle of scenes in order to do that. And so
rather than maybe sort of looking for they've done this, so now I can escalate to this, and then just going with that rather than responding to
they go to and I don't have the continuum from them, but let's say the threat goes up to level 3 and the response is at level 3. Well, then things happen and it kind of calms back down to level 1. Well, the police need to come down too. They don't need to stay at level 3. They need to come down and meet. And this is kind of the idea that officers will need to be more flexible about doing this. This goes into the types of force you can use, bans things like chokeholds and things like that. The KPD needs to explicitly ban things like that. And one of the things is encouraging intervention when if you see another officer who might be using too much force, intervening. KPD's basically completed training on bystander intervention for its officers. That kind of gives the philosophical underpinnings of all of this, but this would be more of a practical application of that. But one thing that they're proposing that would be really something that would be of note is creating a use of force unit within KPD to look at all these incidents and analyze them and draw out best practices and what you can do, what you should do in certain situations, what you shouldn't do. This would be separate from the internal affairs function of the Office of Professional Standards. This would be, they would be looking at necessarily where did this officer violate policy or not. That's what the Office of Professional Standards does. This would be more, this is the techniques. These are the techniques this officer used in this situation, and it was actually really effective. And we didn't think, those kinds of things. We need to make sure that all officers adopt those things like that. This continual improvement thing. They also, looked at instance where officers, stop and search suspects or subjects, really, and which of course is, that's where the Fourth Amendment comes in. The unreasonable, search and seizure protections there. And there are a lot of gray areas. It's very complex. There are these things, what they call Terry stops, where basically officers can stop you if they think you're up to no good, just to see, what you're doing. They don't have to have really probable cause, but it's a real gray area, and KPD, according to the consultants, needs to be more focused on, have the guidelines to tell officers exactly when and where to do this. Another thing that this does, that they also recommend, is documenting and tracking all these kinds of incidents. The officers run into people every day, every shift. There may be dozens of interactions with people who may or may not be up to no good, and they want those incidents to be documented and tracked and be transparent about them. They want officers, some kind of thing where officers would give you a receipt if, for instance, they stop you and question you about something you may have seen or whatever. They give you a receipt. Okay, I did talk to this officer at this and this, such time, and but they want to have records of these incidents internally to see if officers are doing this too often or not enough or whatever. This is all part of kind of dovetails with Noel's idea of using data to manage the department better. But that is those two topics took up close to half of the recommendations, because those are that's where police really interact with the public a lot in ways that can get the department in trouble and violate,
and like you're saying, some of these encounters are things that may not actually produce any citation, any charge, any paperwork at all, any official record that there was an encounter, but that encounter can leave the person who had it with a very bad taste in their mouth about the police department, and KPD wouldn't even know that it ever happened under current circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, there, you hear things are out there, but if you had a particular police officer who stops a particular person every time they see them, every day or every other day or whatever, and it never results in anything, well, that could be an indication that officer is just harassing this person, but they would, they have no way to really track that now. This would help enable them to track such incidents, and if that is the case, then take the appropriate measure to alleviate that, to resolve that situation. And they also looked at what they called impartial policing, which is bias in policing. Again, they talked about the need for fairness and transparency in all their policies to really do this. Two other things that were kind of interesting. One is to have a periodic routine external analyses of how KPD does that, how good of a job they do with impartial policing, or where they fall short. That's having an external somebody look. Of course, these are recommendations, and they didn't say who necessarily, but they said somebody look and give an analysis of how KPD is doing. Another thing would be they strongly suggested that KPD officers undergo training on the history and culture of Knoxville, particularly its underserved communities and minority communities, in order to better understand their cultures. Of course, obviously they get they soak in a lot of that on the streets, but for instance, talking to Hispanic groups about what they have come from, especially the immigrant community. They're not, Hispanic immigrants to here are not all from Mexico. Mm-hmm. It's very different. What people who leave Honduras for different reasons than they leave Mexico or other countries. So it's that's important. Also, the history of the African American community. I mean, one of the things that if you do not talk to people in the African American community, you really don't realize what a traumatic experience urban renewal was for the African American population of Knoxville. It was absolutely earth shattering, and there is plenty of resentment to this day about that, and police officers need to understand that. It's kind of, I mean, they didn't use this as an example, but I am, but they say that officers need to understand this. And the thing here is, they think that training should be done by the community groups themselves. Like Centro Hispano would, perhaps, this is just me coming up with examples. Centro Hispano, talking to them about the immigrant experience, the Hispanic immigrant experience, and not just the group, bringing in citizens. Beck Cultural Exchange Center would be, kind of an obvious choice for talking about the African American experience, because a lot of these officers do not know that and just pick it up as they go, maybe, but they don't have that comprehensive knowledge. Anyway, that's key there. Vehicle pursuits is another thing that they go into detail about, and responding to vulnerable populations. They're fine with the co-response model that we've talked about before. One of the things that they think is that KPD has what they call a crisis intervention team. It's training. You do 40 hours of training on how to deal with people who are going through crises. Now, any officer can take that training. They suggest, because of the limitations of the co-response unit of basically manpower, that more people get that training. That's 40 hours of training for each officer. That's a lot of time. I mean, that's a week. And we have a shortage of officers. And have enough officers who have that training to have officers on every shift in all three patrol districts have that kind of training so they can respond. Also, like the cultural training, have the social service agencies and people who are homeless or have been homeless do training on the challenges of the homeless community and how best to deal with people who are unhoused. all of these things, all of these things require a change of policy about how you deal with people. All of these require training. I didn't add up. There weren't hours added up for everything, but they want training for use. 8 hours of use of force training every year. 8 hours of training on stops every year. That's 2 days that an officer is off the streets just for those trainings. Then you've got the cultural training. You've got the driving training. They want that to be an ongoing thing, not just you learn how to do a police chase in the at the academy and then you go out and don't go back again. And one real emphasis they want to have is a change in how the trainings are done, to have more scenario based training. Anyway, I'm like I said, it was an exhaustive, comprehensive look. I know I've gone on and on about it, and I barely scratched the surface in this. It's you can find this on KPD's website if you're interested in looking at it in more depth. But KPD is going to look at them. They probably won't accept all of them, probably adopt all of them, and it would definitely take time to do. But the first blush from talking to people at KPD that they're looking at implementing at least some of these as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one thing that is worth pointing out, I mean, of course, I think there's a lot of cynicism and skepticism out there about KPD, some of it earned by past behaviors and incidents and so forth. And so I'm sure there will be community advocates watching closely to see how much these things are implemented and to what degree. But the other thing I always like to point out is that KPD is one of two major law enforcement organizations we have in Knox County, the other one being the Sheriff's Office. And while KPD has been going through all of these studies and sort of efforts, especially post 2020 and the George Floyd protests and so forth, our other law enforcement agency has not done any of this at all. The Sheriff's Office has shown literally zero interest in examining its own operations, its own, the existing KPD use of force policy, as you say, is fairly lengthy, although obviously this is making recommendations for making it more detailed. The Sheriff's Office use of force policy is about, I forget, but it's like 3 or 4 sentences, and it's basically only use the force that is reasonable or something to that effect. And so for whatever cynicism or questions or skepticism people may have about KPD, I also always like to remind people that, yes, and we also have another entire law enforcement agency that for decades, literal decades, under multiple sheriffs, has just been consistently resistant to outside oversight, outside accountability, or to ever really taking these. Like, it's almost impossible for me to imagine any Knox County sheriff hiring an outside group like this to come in and give like a lengthy, like that just doesn't happen in the sheriff's office. So,
well, as the consultant said, that it usually doesn't happen anywhere. Right. I mean, this was pretty
until
unusual.
They get in trouble.
Until they get in trouble. And one thing you talked about, okay, the policy is, okay, needs to be, only force can only be used, when reasonable, and KPD has that, and they acknowledge that. And one of the things that the consultants said was KPD has a lot of these, has a decent policy, but it's just vague, essentially, and it needs to be more focused. And this is the level of detail they go into. There is a part of the KPD policy that mentions, kind of the preamble to it was that officers routinely face incidents where they have to use force, and these consultants said, no, that's not true. These consultants ran and crunched the numbers. It's 0.05% of encounters with the public result in any type of use of force. And when I say use of force, I'm not talking about shooting. I'm talking about any kind of physical means used to detain someone and put them or place them under arrest. They said, no, you can't, you drop that word because it doesn't happen all the time. I mean, that's the level of detail that they went into in this study, and that's why I sometimes can get caught up in the weeds talking about it, because there's a lot of interesting stuff in those weeds.
Yeah, for sure.
But studies are all well and good. It depends, and we'll see what which of these recommendations KPD actually adopts and how they decide to do it, because they could. I mean, when 21CP Solutions says you need to be more specific about things, okay, they say you need to be more specific. Well, it's up to KPD to determine which specific things to be specific about. So we'll see. It will depend on a lot of things moving forward. And again, these things are not going to be implemented the first week in January.
Yeah.
It's going to be over time and
implementing policies is one thing. Changing the actual sort of culture and mindset, which is a certain amount of what's being talked about here, takes even longer.
Yeah, and KPD, like the sheriff's office, a lot of the rank and file officers don't like outside scrutiny.
I mean, nobody likes outside scrutiny, but law enforcement agencies in particular have historically been able to operate with especially low levels, I would say.
Yeah, well, and not even outside scrutiny, outside training.
Yeah.
I mean, the report goes into detail saying, hey, listen, modern police departments need to recognize that people in the community have something to offer, and they can, you can take training from people who are not police officers. Traditionally, almost all the training in police departments is done by other police officers. This idea of bringing in people from the community, it does a couple things. You would, I think, ideally it would help integrate the department into the community and not make it so standalone.
Kind of us versus them mentality.
But also, as the report points out, there's some pretty smart people out there who are not police officers that we can learn from.
Yeah. Well, as with all of these things, we will see how it goes and what actually, if anything, gets implemented from that.
And speaking of learning, you are the school systems across the state got their grade cards this week.
Yeah, so this was interesting. In 2016, the state legislature passed a bill, an education accountability bill, that, among other things, called for every public school in the state the state has for quite a while now had something called the state report card, and you can go online and find it, and it will look at each school and its academic performance or the academic performance of its students. And then also its demographics, kind of, you can see a bunch of information there. But the one thing that hasn't been there yet, but was mandated by this 2016 law, is a single letter grade on an A through F scale, so the scale that we're all familiar with from our own school days, that basically providing all of this information about these schools isn't enough. We also want to kind of slap a single letter grade on it that people can look at. And this idea has been controversial since it was proposed, the notion of how exactly are you going to do that? What's going to go into that calculation? And what does it mean? How are people supposed to use that information? I mean, theoretically, this is to kind of tell parents and community members, hey, here's how your schools are performing. But there are, assigning a single letter grade to a school that has 800, 1,200, however many students who are coming into the school, each with their own individual sets of, issues and backgrounds and so forth. And that school has, however, dozens of teachers and team of administrators and whatever. You're going to boil all of that down to one letter and say, here's how this school is doing. That was controversial with public education advocates, with teachers groups and so forth from the beginning. It got even more controversial this fall because Lizette Gonzalez-Reynolds, who is the new education commissioner, came into Governor Lee's administration this past year, she just in November announced that they were actually going to make a change to how they calculated these grades, and that in what had been talked about in the past was that the biggest component would be what they call academic growth, and that's basically measuring each student year to year. How did they perform on the reading test in third grade versus how they performed in fourth grade, regardless of like what their actual scores are. Did they improve? Did they go from being in the 21st percentile to the 27th percentile, or did they go the other direction? And so the idea behind those growth scores is that it levels the playing field a little bit between schools that have very different student populations, because you're just measuring each student's individual growth as opposed to comparing them to like every student in the state. Well, Reynolds changed that to emphasize most strongly just each student's sort of raw performance on state tests. So like the TCAPs that they take every year, grades 3 through 8, you're going to grade just like 50% of this letter grade now at all levels, K through 12, 50% of it is just the raw test scores. How well did the students in this school score in raw numbers on the state tests? And then in elementary and middle schools, 40% of it is that growth calculation. And then the other 10% is a growth calculation just for the lowest performing 25% of students. So giving a little bit of extra weight to like, how well are we doing with kids at that lower end? But still, half of the score, and this was a change from what had been talked about previously, half of the grade is just how well did your students do on the test? Well, anybody who follows education knows, and has known forever, for as long as we've been doing standardized tests, that the single most consistent predictor of how students in a school do on state tests is the socioeconomic background of the school. And this is just true across the board. It's true across the country. Schools with higher socioeconomic status, and that's students from more affluent families, students from families with college-educated parents, all of those kinds of socioeconomic measures, those students do better on tests. Like, they just do. And you could go, like, there's a whole set of complicated reasons for that. But also, I think intuitively, most of us kind of understand that. Like, yeah, a kid from an affluent family where both parents are college educated and also have access to, high quality preschool programs, and also probably are parents who are like reading to their kids every night. Like, all of those things that you absorb from your environment very much shape how well you then perform when you show up at school. And any teacher anywhere will tell you this, that, like, I have kids for 40 minutes a day, the whole rest of the time, or if you're a grade school teacher, you have kids for 6 hours a day. But the whole rest of the time, they are out in whatever, environment they are living in and growing up in. And those are the things that, if you're just looking at raw test scores, that's the biggest predictor. So when Reynolds came out and said this, a whole bunch of people, teachers groups, public education advocates, state legislators, especially Democrats in the legislature who just kind of don't like this whole system, all came out and said, like, this is not a good way to measure what you say you're trying to measure and to assign a grade to a school, because mostly you're just going to be measuring, like, who are the kids who are in the school. And you kind of don't even need, like, you can just look at the demographics of a school. You don't need to. Yeah,
that's true. You don't need those stinking test scores,
right? Or the letter grade or whatever. And so they came out. They finally, first they were going to release them in November, then they didn't release them in November. Then it was going to be early December. They finally released these grades for every. Well, not every, because you have to be a big enough school or have enough students who are tested in order to have enough data for them to do the calculations. But most public schools in the state, 83 schools in Knox County, got these grades this past week. They released them on Thursday, right? Which Knox County went on Christmas break on Wednesday. I think most schools in the state probably did. So most schools are out of session when these things show up. And they were also released the day before the entire state government shuts down for a 4-day weekend. You mentioned news dumps earlier.
Yeah.
This is what we in the news business call this, when somebody releases a big report that maybe they don't want to talk about a whole lot. We always talk about Friday news dumps. Like you release something like late Friday afternoon. Nobody reads the paper on Saturdays anyway. Most of your media organizations don't have many people working on weekends. And so it's hard to, get comprehensive coverage for these kinds of things. And so I'm not saying that the state did this on purpose, pushed out this fairly controversial and contentious measure after waiting 7 years on the Thursday before Christmas in order to avoid talking about it. Whatever their reasons for that, maybe it was just like, they were trying to meet a deadline and that's how long it took. But the net result was that that's when it came out. Local school officials, not both here and across the state, not super thrilled with this because, they're afraid parents are going to be hearing these scores without any context or without any opportunity to ask questions about it. Hard for the media to ask questions about it because, hey, the state's shut down until next Tuesday, and probably it'll still be hard to get in touch with anybody, next week. As we were saying, often people aren't around that last week of the year anyway. So there's that side of it. But then there's the substantive side, which is what do these numbers actually say? And so in Knox County, and I have, because they just dumped all this yesterday. We're recording this on Friday and they released it on Thursday. I haven't had time to go through every single school yet, but I just went and looked at the school. About 19 schools got A's, the letter grade A, meaning that's the top score you could get. Only 4 schools in the county got F's, and then another 20 or so got D's. But I just went and ran quick numbers on the schools that got F's and the schools that got A's. And every school that got an F has at least 40% of its students identified as economically disadvantaged, meaning they're from low-income families. And a couple of them had more than 50%. Austin East Magnet High School, for example, had more than 50%. Vine Middle School, more than 50% of their students are in that economically disadvantaged category. The schools that got A's, 11 of those 19 had 10% or less of their students identified as economically disadvantaged, and only 5 of them had more than 20%. And none of them had more than 40%, whereas all of the schools that had F's had more than 40%. Now, does this mean that every single school that has similar socioeconomic demographics to another school that they are going to score exactly the same? No, it doesn't. And, the growth measures are part of the calculation, and it could certainly be theoretically interesting to look at 2 schools that both have 25% of kids who are economically disadvantaged, and yet they're showing different results. That could be interesting to go and try to figure out what's going on. Of course, economically disadvantaged is only one category. There's also, you have to look at how many kids are students with disabilities, how many are English language learners who are the actual lowest performers on state tests across the board. So if you have a lot of English language learners in your school, again, you're almost automatically going to have a lower grade. Superintendent John Ryswick came out and said that basically we appreciate the state's efforts to promote transparency and accountability, but also we think that you can't really boil down any school's performance and services and so forth to one letter grade. People who are more critical of Governor Lee, and again, especially Democrats in the legislature and people who are strong advocates for public education, who are suspicious of Lee's push for universal school vouchers, feel like both the timing of this and the way that the calculation was changed to put so much emphasis just on raw test scores, they think that what this is really about is trying to make public schools look bad in order to build support for school vouchers, to say that, hey, look at all these schools we have that have F's and D's. They are failing your kids, and so maybe you'd be interested in a voucher that you could use to go to a different school, to go to a private school, and so forth. One thing about that is that regardless of whether schools are charter schools or private schools or whatever, and private schools, it's hard to see because they mostly don't report this kind of data, but charter schools do because they're subject to the same state laws. Charter schools also show the same kind of effects. Charter schools tend to have lower socioeconomic populations, And they also tend to, in raw numbers, score less well than schools with higher socioeconomic demographics. And so, I think one of the questions about the voucher program, for example, if it gets passed, is will these same kinds of metrics and maybe even letter grades be used to apply to private schools so that parents can theoretically make comparisons? There's been resistance to that. I don't think private schools are going to want to go down that path. No. But regardless of that, it just kind of, there's this idea that gets thrown about, this phrase you hear, failing schools. And the concern from people who are critical of this whole rating system is that that's what this is going to be used to do, and say, look at these schools that are failing. But there's a whole other way of looking at that, which is that those are the schools that have the student populations with the greatest challenges. And so it's not necessarily the school that's failing, because really what we're talking about is students. We're really talking about student performance. That's what's being measured here. And that it's kind of fundamentally unfair to compare a school that has 50% of its kids who are economically disadvantaged to a school like Farragut High School that has less than 5% of its kids economically disadvantaged. Does that, if you're just going to say Farragut High School is in A and Austin East High School is in F, which is exactly what this actually says, does that mean that all the teachers at Farragut are that much better than all the teachers at Austin East? Or does it mean that the kids at Austin East are dealing with a panoply of challenges that the kids at Farragut High School are not dealing with? And that's the kind of nuance that obviously just disappears when you're just looking at letter grades.
Yeah, and one thing that you talked about too was the improvement not being valued as much. And to go back to the letter grade thing, basically this system rewards the school that would be a B every year, but a school that would improve from F to B is still the same. Even though they made greater strides and the others just kind of cruised, the ones that make greater strides don't. Who cares? That's the thing. Or if they go from F to C, they would improve tremendously. But when you just look at the cold grade, it's still underperforming compared to B, even though B just kind of maintained the status quo.
Right, which could, like, if you're a school that just gets a B every year, assuming they continue to do this every year, that could just mean that, well, you're just serving basically the same socioeconomic level.
Doing the same thing, yeah. Yeah, nothing. They're not doing any better.
Right.
Not doing any worse. They're just kind of maintaining.
Well, and I think there's also a whole issue here with morale. It's already hard to recruit and especially retain teachers and administrators in schools that have more challenged and challenging populations. Yeah. And so if you're a teacher at Austin East or Vine Middle School working your butt off, and there are a lot of teachers at Austin East and Vine Middle School working their butts off, like I know some of them, and you see all the challenges that your students have, and you're so proud of them when they, achieve to whatever level they're able to. And here comes the state, which theoretically is supposed to be there to support you and provide resources, and gives you a D, or an F. That's not going to feel really good for the students. They'll hear about it. They'll know that they're at an F school. Certainly not going to feel good for the teachers. Not going to feel good for the principals. And I think the question is, like, for all of the potential damage or ill will that generates, like, what's the benefit to it? Like, we already know which schools have more poor kids. Yeah. We don't really need letter grades to tell us which schools have more poor kids.
Yeah, and you get back to the timing again, too. Merry freaking Christmas.
Yeah.
Your school's an F.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's but yeah, that was the first thing I thought of when I found out they were going to be releasing these was, boy, the schools that don't score real well are really going to be that's going to be a kick in the stomach, right before Christmas.
Yeah. Well, We'll see what kind of weight ends up being put on this, or if those schools that have D's and F's are subjected to still greater state scrutiny and all of these kinds of things. I mean, they're already under a fair. I mean, if already under the existing system, if your school was struggling for too many years in a row, you face the prospect of being taken over by the state. Like, there's already a lot of accountability in the system, but now this is just coming along and slapping a letter grade on things that I think most people probably already know.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll see what, if anything, comes out of all that in terms of its impact on, say, the voucher discussion and so forth. I guess that wraps us up with what we were going to talk about this week, and my eggnog is almost gone. And this is the part of the show where we usually talk about what's coming up next week. But Scott, what's coming up next week?
Nothing.
Yeah.
No major things. Next weekend we've got New Year's Eve, but I mean, between as far as what we cover, the government, education, nothing is on the calendar. We will report what does happen, but we don't know what that's going to be.
We will be running every year between Christmas and New Year's. We run sort of a series of year in review articles. It's a good time to look back and remember what all has happened in the various realms that we pay attention to. So that will be coming up, and we will be here on the podcast next week to probably mostly talk about that and anything else that happens. If there is breaking news this coming week, it's probably not going to be good news because nobody has scheduled anything to happen. And so if there is some big thing for us to talk about, like a coal ash spill or somebody burning down a Planned Parenthood office, which is something that happened between Christmas and New Year's a couple of years ago.
The coal ash spill in Kingston happened on December 22nd.
That's right.
Of 2008.
Knock on whatever.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah,
we should all be hoping.
That took up a year of my life after that, so we don't want it.
Yeah, we should all be hoping that we do not have breaking news to talk about, because it probably won't be good if there is. So, for now, we will just say Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Thanks, as always, to Lord Seth Barber for his production here and the homemade Christmas cookies that he has provided for us. Thank you, Seth.
And Merry Christmas, Seth.
Merry Christmas to you, fellas.
And our theme music is by Will Wright. Ho, ho, ho!
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.